Okay, I just watched a clip of CGTN and they were discussing the situation in Hong Kong. There was an American, Brandon Blackburn Dwyer, who is the founder of Grasshopper Strategies. I've no idea what that is. I didn't watch the discussion from the start. But he was talking about, he was rightly pointing out how the concern about the extradition law is not that murderers, people guilty of heinous crimes, um, shouldn't be extradited to the mainland. It's that the law would be abused. And that's precisely the problem here. And I'm going to address a case that's got attention around this in a minute. But the woman on CGTN was just towing the party line, basically, which she's paid to do. CGTN's a mouthpiece of the Communist Party. Um, and she was claiming that the extradition bill is dead and it's no chance of being revised or brought back. Um, but the whole point here is that once again Beijing is just lying. I mean, they're trying to frame it as the Hong Kong protesters are kind of enabling criminals, murderers. There's people who are on the pro-China side who say, oh, well, the protests help, for example, a guy that killed his Taiwanese girlfriend. I'm conservative on crime. I believe criminals should be punished. And I'm sure there's many Hong Kongers feel that way. But there's another issue going on here, which is that the extradition law would be abused. Now, it's important to understand that. We know this to be the case because China has a track record of basically kidnapping dissidents, like the booksellers in Hong Kong. That's a very, very important issue to understand because that is the basis of the concerns that the extradition law would be abused. So, I'll go read out a case. This is from the Eye. I find it easier just reading things out rather than yeah, because this is an article by Kelvin Chan in today's Eye. An official at the British consulate in Hong Kong, who was detained during a trip to mainland China 2 weeks ago, has been given 15 days of administrative detention in the city of Shenzhen for violating public order laws, China said yesterday. A foreign ministry spokesman in Beijing, Geng Shuang, said the case was not a diplomatic issue. The Foreign Office in London has said it is extremely concerned about its staff member, Simon Cheng who is a trade and investment officer at the Scottish Development International section of the consulate. He attended a business event in Shenzhen on the 8th of August, but never returned to neighbouring Hong Kong despite plans to do so the same day. It is unclear whether he possessed a diplomatic passport. Mr Geng said that Mr Cheng was a Hong Kong resident and not a UK citizen. He said he had violated regulations on punishments in public order and security administration, but gave no further details. Public order and security infractions are generally minor. The maximum penalty for such transgressions is 15 days detention. The seizure of consular staff of any status or rank is highly unusual, despite Beijing's declaration of a golden era in Sino-British ties. That seems laughable now. Relations have grown tense in recent months amid pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. Regarding the series of words and deeds by the British side recently on Hong Kong-related issues, we have repeatedly lodged solemn complaints with the UK, Mr Geng added. Hong Kong police said that law enforcement agencies were notified about the case by mainland Chinese authorities under a mutual notification arrangement set up for such cases. Well, needless to say, his family is very concerned. And today, they're trying to, there, there's rumors that they're trying to pin prostitution's claims on this guy. It's always difficult to know what exactly whenever it comes to the legal status of anyone detained by China, it's always difficult to follow the process because what's happened here with so many cases, first of all, Geng Shuan claims that China knows nothing about the status of Mr. Mankit, but then they go on to say, oh, well, he's been detained for this minor infraction of local laws. And now it's being reported that he's being accused of soliciting prostitutes, which sounds like a total smear. I think instead of taking this nonsense from China about solemn offence and all the usual rhetoric they come out with, we need to demand that China produces evidence. He may not be a British citizen, but he works for the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, and as such, we have a responsibility to speak up for him. It's like we have a moral responsibility to Afghan interpreters. They may not be British citizens, but they risk their lives to work for the British Army. So, by the same principle, if a Hong Kong resident, even if he or she is not a British citizen, is detained by the Chinese regime, then I think we've a moral responsibility to speak out. What I would really like to see is the British side being a lot more vocal with China. I'm sick and tired of these arrogant communist officials playing the victim. I mean, put it this way: if this guy's guilty, they'd have evidence, they'd have clear evidence to show that. But I find it suspicious that they start off by claiming that they don't know about the case. Now, how can they claim they don't know about it on one hand, and then try to downplay it on the other? Oh, it's not a diplomatic issue. I don't think we should take this lightly. And I think we need to notch up the rhetoric in general. Frankly, for too damn long, we've been polite with China, too polite. We've put up with their insults. We've put up with their pathetic whining about being victims. I can name a whole catalogue of insults China has made against this country. Just as one example, CGTN reporter Kong Ling Lin in Birmingham, in the UK, having a very ill-mannered rant against a speaker at a forum on liberty in Hong Kong, then assaulting a young volunteer, getting arrested, then having the arrogance to play the victim, and the Chinese embassy actually, instead of apologizing, they actually criticize the British side. I think that the Chinese regime is like the playground bully. It only understands force. And the pretenses at politeness, the pretenses at diplomatic niceties will not hide the fact that this is fundamentally a nasty, unpleasant, totalitarian regime that doesn't really give a damn about the rule of law or international norms. So, when I was watching that CGTN debate, seeing the CGTN woman so blatantly serving as a mouthpiece for the Communist Party. I mean, they can't think critically. They cannot think independently. They take orders from Xi Jinping. CGTN reporters, some of them may be decent people as individuals and they may want to be independent journalists, but ultimately it's a Chinese media network, therefore they take orders from the Communist Party. And if you think otherwise, you're just being naive because that is how it works in a totalitarian state. I think Mitch McConnell said that sooner or later the rest of the world is going to have to understand the grievances of the Hong Kong protesters are actually symbolic of a wider issue. And at some point, the rest of the world, or at least democracies, are going to need to stand up to China. I believe that for too long, we have taken this idea that, oh, if we placate China, if we kind of go along with their rhetoric, if we're overly polite and diplomatic, then maybe China will reform. That hasn't worked. Okay, it's time to see this regime for what it is, and the only language a bully understands is force, right? So this young man, if he's guilty, then they can produce evidence, and that's that. But I think it's suspicious. I think the timing of it's suspicious. Um, like the report says, it's highly unusual. So we need to be very assertive. I think we need to mandate that Chinese students in the UK, I've said this before, I'll say it again, I think we need to mandate that before getting a visa, they should promise not to get involved in pro CCP rallies. As far as I'm concerned, that is showing hostile intent to the host nation. If Westerners in China are now in a situation where they're being getting all sorts of things thrown at them, um, you know, it's not an easy time to be a Westerner in China working. I mean, not so much talking about tourists, but the Chinese regime, for example, is trying to close in on English teachers because they fear too much foreign influence. So, if China's going to get more of a jingoistic attitude, I'm not suggesting we respond with jingoism. Western countries must be more open, but I also think we need to be more assertive. So let's welcome Chinese tourists, let's welcome Chinese students, but with strong caveats that they do not come here to serve basically as agents of the Communist Party. I'm not saying spies, I'm saying agents, as cheerleaders, because that is insulting the host nation. Um, and we need to tell Beijing that we know what they're doing. I am sick and tired of this regime playing the victim when the reality is they are the oppressors. They are the totalitarian state. And for too damn long, I don't entirely agree with Trump's trade war because I think it's going to hurt Americans in particular, but I do agree with the tough rhetoric on China. I think for too long, Western governments have taken this idea, well, if we move softly with China, they'll reform of their own accord. Xi Jinping's regime has shown no intention of reforming. It's only getting worse. And I really think Hong Kong is a major, major test in terms of East West relations. I think the only valid approach at this point is that we start using China's own language. We start making grave and solemn overtures to Beijing. And frankly, I think we should make threats. I think we should threaten to expel the ambassador if this sort of behavior continues. I don't want to see an escalation, but what is worse, in my opinion, than the escalation is a situation where we're being walked over and we're allowing Beijing to just get its way. I think that is absolutely unfathomable. I think it's grotesque, in fact. I want to see the Johnson administration speaking out vocally against China. I was encouraged a few weeks ago when actually it was still in the last government, but when Jeremy Hunt took issue with the distortion that his counterpart was making, the Chinese ambassador, and the ambassador was summoned to explain himself. I want to see more of that sort of approach. I think expelling an ambassador is a very drastic step, and I do think it should be a last measure, but I do think we should put it on the table. It's come to that. Let's just get rid of this fantasy of Sino-British golden relations. That's all it is. It's a fantasy. It's uh, it's just a slogan that means nothing because right now, I think we absolutely cannot trust the regime in Beijing, and we need to show that. If Brexit is really about taking back control, we need to show we can stand up to the world's second most powerful country. You know, and it's not because we're doing it because Trump says so. We're doing it in their own national interests. I believe China poses an existential threat to this country. Not necessarily military, but undermining our democracy by stoking up the Chinese diaspora, by espionage through Huawei, I believe through a range of other factors. I absolutely do not trust this regime, and I want to see the government getting tough. I really do. I allowed myself at one point to think, well, maybe we can have a golden era in British Chinese relations. I even wanted it because I have a lot of Chinese friends. I've had a lot of relations in my life with Chinese people, friendships, business relations. So I take no pleasure from any of this. But I do not think we can function by simply continuing to go softly, softly with this regime. I really don't. I think that's just not the right approach. So I would like to see tougher rhetoric coming from our side instead of the constant pandering the Chinese demands um, and pathetic Chinese overtures that they are the victims. They're not. China's been undermining and interfering in Western democracies far, far more than the West has been doing in China. And I'm sick of it.